Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Infinite Dial Canada. We're going to get started now, and I will hand it over to Edison Research Senior VP, Tom Webster.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks to all of you for attending this webinar, the third annual Infinite Dial Canada. We're very pleased to be able to bring you this. I'm Tom Webster from Edison, and joining me today from our partners at Triton Digital is Stephanie Donovan. Stephanie, how are you? Oh, Stephanie, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. That'll be the only time I do that. So excited to be a part of this today. Thanks for the opportunity, and we look forward to it.
Absolutely. And before we get started, I have to tell you that the pandemic has robbed me of Canada in a very sad way. I was supposed to be off today. In fact, I was supposed to be on a 2-week trip this week and next week on the Rocky Mountaineer across Banff and Lake Louise and all through the Canadian Rockies. And that was sadly stolen from me, Stephanie. Well,
it's a beautiful country, and now I'm jealous. So we'll just have to reconvene with all the up there probably in Q4, hopefully Q4.
You're jealous of my apartment is what you're jealous of, because that's all I've seen in 13 weeks. But enough of that. It's time to talk about the Infinite Dial in Canada. This is our third Infinite Dial for Canada. It's a project that's very, very important to Edison, of course. But Stephanie, it's also very important to Triton.
It is, and thanks so much again. We love the opportunity to co-present the Infinite Dial, and especially the Infinite Dial Canada. Tom, I don't know if you know, many on the call probably know that Triton is actually a Canadian tech success story. Our development started, our online audio development started in Canada, still resides in Montreal. Most recently, we expanded into Toronto, but our heritage, and we proudly serve the Canadian broadcasters with digital audio solutions. We do today, and we have for more than 14 years. So this is incredibly exciting for us, especially because I've seen some of the research, and I think it's going to be an exciting time and something much tweeted about after the call.
I think so too. I think there's a lot of really good news today, I think, for the digital audio space especially. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn off my camera so that you can all focus on the beautiful slides that our team has put together, and we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Infinite Dial, in America, the Infinite Dial is the longest running survey of digital media consumer behavior. And our report here in Canada is going to mirror the methodologies and the questions of that so that we can really start to make global comparisons country to country. Essentially, what we do in the Infinite Dial series, which we have conducted since 1998 in the United States, we look at the penetration of online digital audio, online platforms, things like podcasting, in-car media, and we're going to make some comparisons today between the US and Canada and also some of the other global markets that we have conducted the Infinite Dial in. The methodology for this study, we maintain consistently from country to country. We use the gold standard for survey research, which is telephone research, and we conduct that survey research using both landlines and mobile phones to the appropriate percentage or proportion for the country in which we work. It's random digit dialing. In Canada, we offer the survey in both English and in French, and very soon after we get this survey up, we will publish the French edition of this. And the data is weighted to Canadian national 18 plus population figures. And I will mention this again as we move forward. If you're looking to make comparisons here with the Infinite Dial US, we've made them for you in this deck. If you go back and look at the Infinite Dial US deck, you'll note that the Infinite Dial in the United States is a survey amongst Americans 12 plus. In Canada, it's 18 plus. So the comparisons that I will show you in this deck are apples to apples, 18 plus American, 18 plus Canadian. So do keep that in mind if you see a number that you don't recognize, for instance, from the US study. So we're going to start things off with a look at kind of the overall landscape of media and technology in Canada. And of course, all of the technologies that we talk about start with the mobile phone, specifically the smartphone, that device in your pocket that gives you ubiquitous global broadband Wi-Fi and really allows the consumption of all of these devices. And we're showing you here Canada today versus all of the history that we have tracked in the United States. And as you can see, amongst Canadians 18 plus, actually a slightly higher percentage of Canadians 18 plus own a smartphone than is true of their counterparts in the United States. And although that number grows slowly year over year, Stephanie, we've actually, beneath that slow growing number, seen a pretty significant change in the last 12 months, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think one of the spikes that happened was about June of last year. All three major Canadian data carriers, Rogers, Telos, and Bell, released unlimited data plans. And since then, as it's rolled out, even PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, touted not only the increase in data consumption that has happened, but certainly for Canadian consumers, almost an 80% decrease in overage charges. So they've really reduced the barrier for users to connect with data, connect on mobile, and that may be a major contributor of why we're seeing such a growth.
And we're going to see some data a little bit later on that we think really reveals pent-up demand that has now been realized and recognized for digital audio as a result of finally getting compelling unlimited data plans in Canada. We also track tablet ownership, and that's really leveled off in the United States and is even lower in Canada than it is in the United States. 46% of Canadians 18 plus own a tablet. That's a market it's an interesting market. It's sort of been squeezed by larger phones more than anything. I have an iPhone 10 XS, which you would think stands for extra small, but actually stands for the size of 2 pockets, which is almost the size of the iPad mini. And so the tablets in that way have sort of been squeezed out a little bit, but they've certainly leveled off at a fairly high number. We also track smart speakers and the entire smart speaker category. Certainly, if you're familiar with the work that Edison has done with NPR and the Smart Audio Report, you've seen a lot of our American data. But here we look at the Canadian market, and the Canadian market is a little bit different than the American market. And the most notable difference that you will see is that Google leads in this market, as opposed to Amazon, which edges out Google in the American market. Google was really firstest with the mostest in Canada, although Amazon has certainly made a strong premiere well over a year ago, continues to see strong sales. In terms of awareness, which is what we are looking at here, significantly more Canadians 18 plus are familiar with the Google Home suite of products than in America. And in terms of the Amazon Alexa suite of products, they're about tied. And for both markets, nearly 80% have heard of smart speakers. And Stephanie, those are pretty big numbers, I think.
They are big, but I would challenge your most notable, because what was most notable to me is the 23% that haven't heard of a smart speaker. Might have to work on that branding.
Yes, maybe they haven't been watching TV or looking at things. I don't know. And we're going to show you globally what that looks like as well. Globally, in terms of the awareness of the category, in the last 5 countries that we have conducted infinite dial surveys, Australia actually leads at 85%. But Canada and the United States are certainly right up there in terms of the awareness of this particular category. Now, ownership, again, is another story. In the United States, 24%, if you look all the way at the bottom, who own any of the above, 24% of Americans 18 plus own at least one smart speaker. In Canada, that number is 26%, so it's even higher. And again, it's led by Google. 14% of Canadians 18 plus own a Google Home device. That's compared to 10% in the US. And that's really reversed with the Alexa suite of devices, with 11% of Canadians 18 plus owning an Alexa device and 19% owning an Alexa device in the United States. And of course, the Apple HomePod is on there as well, kind of limping along, I think. When we look at smart speaker ownership across the last 5 countries that we've conducted infinite dial surveys in, Canada really leads the world. If your world is 5 countries, has certainly higher smart speaker ownership than the US, Australia, and significantly more than South Africa and Germany. And one thing that we've been tracking in the United States for a number of years is not just the percentage of people who own a device, but the number of devices that they own. And in the US, you can see at the bottom this year, we reported earlier that if you own a smart speaker, chances are you own more than one smart speaker. In fact, the average is 2.1. Now, Stephanie, that average in Canada is 1.7. Is that a number you think will go up, or do we think Canada will always be lower than the United States? How does that fit in?
Well, I'm not sure if it will go up as much, but regardless, broadly speaking, smart speakers are bringing audio back into the home. And whether that growing mean number moves to 2.1, but what it does mean is that growing number is essentially more radios inside the home. So as much as we can move and people adopt more, the better, but also it means that there's growing listenership in the home, which is actually extending time with broadcast or online radio brands.
Now, one thing I want to remind everybody of, it was on the methodology slide earlier, we actually collected this data in the first quarter of this year. And that's important to us because it was collected around the same time as the Infinite Dial US, but more importantly, at the same time as the Infinite Dial Canada was last year. That's important for us to be able to make comparisons. And so these data do not reflect our current life in quarantine, but they do reflect sort of our typical lives, and hopefully we'll go back to some semblance of that before too much longer. And I say that to put this slide in context. When we ask Canadians, have you listened to AM/FM radio in the last week? The number here at 69%, very, very comparable to the US number at 68%, which, as you can see, has been fairly flat year over year. What does that say about AM/FM and not just American, but Canadian loyalty to AM/FM radio, Stephanie?
Well, it says a lot. And again, going back to that unlimited data plan, this could be one of the impacts of such. But what it says is that the habits are shifting, but the brand loyalty is staying with AM/FM radio, which is significant and fantastic. We took a deeper look with our webcast metrics and saw similar to what we're looking at here, which is the growth year over year is happening. It's trending when you look at broadcast audience, specific broadcast online audio data. It's trending in very much the same way.
And I want to remind everybody here as well that these data will be available shortly after the webinar, and a replay of the entire webinar will be available soon. And if you'd like to tweet about this, we love the Twitter. The hashtag is Infinite Dial. So let's talk a little bit now about the world of online audio, which is certainly one of the things that the Infinite Dial was originally designed to track all the way back in 1998. And let's talk again about AM/FM radio. When we ask people if you have listened to an AM/FM radio station online, the stream of an AM/FM radio station in the last month, again, Canada actually leads the United States here. 21% of Canadians 18 plus have done so, compared to 19% of their brethren south of their border. And when we look at AM/FM online consumption in the last week, again, it's 14%, very comparable to the US number, which has been flat essentially for the last 5 years. And now let's take a look at monthly online audio listening. And this is anything you can listen to online, essentially, whether that is AM/FM radio content that's streamed online or streamed audio content that's available only on the internet, things like Spotify and Apple Music and so on. And here again, Canada leads the US. 70% of Canadians 18 plus say they've listened to some form of online audio in the last month. And in the last couple of years that we have tracked the Infinite Dial in Canada, the Canadian number has lagged. And it's been really essentially reflective of where the US was about 2 years ago. And I think as Stephanie rightfully pointed out early on, there's been a change in the availability of attractive unlimited data plans in Canada. And I think what we're seeing here is the release of all of that pent-up demand. People always wanted to listen to online audio, and now more people are sort of free from the shackles of Wi-Fi, which is not really a shackle. And we've seen that pent-up demand be released, and we've seen Canada actually come to the fore here. And in fact, compared to the last 5 countries that we have conducted Infinite Dial research in, a higher percentage of Canadians 18 plus say they've listened to online audio in the last month than in Australia, the US, South Africa, or Germany. So no longer does Canada sort of lag behind the United States in these categories. I think there always was that pent-up demand, and we're now seeing that released. We take a look at weekly online audio listening. Again, this number, first of all, is still very, very high. It's not that much smaller than the monthly online audio listening number, which means there's pretty significant conversion here from monthly to weekly as it becomes more and more habitual for Canadians. And again, Canada really leads here at 60% of Canadians 18 plus saying they've listened to online audio in the last week compared to 58% of Americans. And again, we like to look at that across the last 5 countries to make a quasi-global comparison. And it's essentially a three-way tie here between the United States, Australia, and Canada, all about 60% of the country, 18 plus, saying they've listened to online audio in the last week. Now, we like to talk about various brands of online audio in both countries. And this year, we started by tracking awareness. And certainly we have a big 3 at the top here with Apple Music, Spotify, and Google Play Music. One thing I will point out that is very different from the United States Infinite Dial survey is there's no Pandora in Canada. And of course, if you've watched any of the Infinite Dial research from the United States, you'll note that Pandora is typically number 1 on this list in the United States, but there's no Pandora in Canada. Now, last year, Stephanie, we saw the beginnings really of a coalescing of this market in terms of the brand space with a big 3. And it looks like we see that again this year, but what else do we see in terms of brand awareness?
Yeah, so 2 major things. And you may remember, Tom, you and I stood on the stage at Canadian Music Week and presented this as that really migration of audience to the top 3. And that's still happening. I mean, those 3 have grown 25%. But the other story is watching that mid-tier, Amazon, iHeart, and SoundCloud. They are now at least 50% of brand awareness. And that's a growth from last year. So I think we now have not just a coalescing of the 3, but more contributors into this space. And I think that's only going to not only drive online audio, but drive competition.
There was a question in the chat box, which I want to get to before we move on. And there is you can ask questions in chat. I'm more likely to see them in the Q&A section of Zoom, if you wouldn't mind doing that. But we got a question, why is Germany so far behind the United States, Canada, and Australia in terms of online audio? And a big reason for that is simply how ubiquitous Wi-Fi is and the availability of unlimited broadband and Wi-Fi. That tends to be the rate limiting factor in almost any country that we look at. The longer that unlimited data or at least fairly unlimited data and ubiquitous Wi-Fi are around, the higher the penetration you're going to see. Comparing the US and Canada here, at least in terms of brand awareness, there are some fairly big differences. Apple Music, really strong in awareness in Canada, even stronger than in the United States, as are Spotify and Google Play Music. In the United States, however, you see Amazon Music higher, and we have shown in our Infinite Dial US reports that a good deal of that recent growth is down to smart speaker ownership and people defaulting to Amazon Music as their music service of choice. Of course, iHeartRadio, which has promoted their app considerably across US terrestrial radio stations. And we see SoundCloud pop a little bit more in Canada as well. So definitely some differences between the 2. And one of the biggest reasons for some of these differences is certainly not having Pandora in the market makes the market look a little bit different. When we ask people which brand did you listen to in the last month, there's a clear winner here, with Spotify being named by more than twice as many Canadians as the next choice here, Apple Music. And certainly in the United States, we see at the top of these lists, Spotify and Pandora kind of a close 1 and 2 in most of these lists. And with not having Pandora there, Spotify is really claiming a market lead in Canada. So that is a significant difference from the United States. But here we see things like Stingray, Canadian brand, CBC Music pop up there, and even Radio Player Canada. Again, some differences between Canada and the United States. Spotify is even larger in Canada. Certainly, again, without having Pandora to compete with, there are other competitive sources here, such as Apple Music and Google Play Music and SoundCloud, all of which lead in Canada compared to the United States. And as you might expect, iHeart and Amazon are a bit bigger in the United States. Now, we asked people who use any of these brands, what is the brand that you use most often? And here, I think, is the clearest indicator of the differences between the U.S. and Canadian market in terms of the services that we use. On the bottom, you can see when we ask, what is the brand you use most often? It's really a tie between Spotify and Pandora, with Apple in third, Amazon in fourth, Google Play, and then a variety of other sources, some of which we have seen. But in Canada, it looks considerably different. There's not as strong a number two competitor here. 37% of Canadians who use any of these brands say that Spotify is the one that they use most often. And you see Apple in second, Google Play, and then CBC and Stingray right up there as well. But certainly Spotify has consolidated a lead in terms of the P1 or the service that people prefer in Canada. Now, when we ask people who listen to online audio what that time is replacing, we get a pretty interesting picture here. And of course, again, these data were collected before we all went into quarantine, before our commutes went away. Once our commutes went away, things, of course, got very, very different. But here you see 34% of online audio listeners say it has replaced time spent with AM/FM radio. But there are some other interesting aspects to this graph, Stephanie. And what does this graph tell you about how online audio is or isn't cannibalizing terrestrial radio?
I think it's a powerful story to see that it's not a either or. It's new time spent with an online source. It's new time spent perhaps with a broadcast radio. And what overall this says is that digital audio, because of its portability and its ability to expand content, whether it's live streaming or internet only, and add podcasting in there, this is a powerful document in terms of how the audience is moving their consumption habits, not necessarily their brand choices. Now, one thing I'll note, Tom, just to reiterate Twitter and the hashtag Infinite Dial, I foretell that this slide is going to be a much tweeted slide in future years to come as we watch those consumption habits change. Mark my words, and we'll come back next year and see if, and because this is being recorded, we'll see if this is true.
There you have it, a Twitter prediction from Stephanie Donovan. We're going to move now into in-car audio. And for our younger listeners, back in February of 2020, there were things called cars, and we drove them places to work and to places. And this data was, of course, collected from back then. And we're going to look at how audio consumption in the car has changed and how it differs from the United States and some of the other key measures that we look at. First of all, we asked people, what are the sources of audio that you use in your car? And of course, this adds to more than 100 because people use multiple sources. And you can see here that the US and Canada are fairly equal in terms of AM/FM radio, nearly 80% for both. And they're also fairly equal in podcasts. And we're going to get specifically to Canadian podcast consumption in a few moments. Where you see bigger differences between the US and Canada, first of all, at the bottom, SiriusXM certainly has a presence in Canada, but a greater presence in the United States. But online radio is really the only remaining key digital audio metric that lags that far behind the US. And it's not necessarily technology, as we're going to see in a moment, but it's probably just a lag as people get used to being able to use better data plans and better mobile wireless plans for their data and media consumption in the car. I predict that this will probably bounce up again significantly next year. But Stephanie, it looks like AM/FM radio in the car remains the dominant source of content.
Absolutely, which is a great statement. But I will say it's no longer exclusive, which is a position that AM/FM has widely held for years. It is those users likely connecting with their phones, as you said, and as we'll see in just a moment, with those connected in-car dash entertainment systems, where we're going to see a lot more differentiation as well as expansion of the content they're consuming and the time that they're spending with those different platforms.
So these are the platforms that they ever use. We also asked, what is the audio source you use most often in the car. Now, certainly in the United States, AM/FM radio remains the number one source of audio in the car. But at 50%, it can really no longer say it has the majority answer here. It's sort of verging into the plurality. But in Canada, 57% of people who drive or ride in cars say that AM/FM radio is the audio source they use most often. And we see, as you might expect from the previous graph, some online sources really lagging behind the U.S. figures here. But that owned music figure is quite strong, Stephanie. What do you think's behind that?
Well, it was interesting, and we actually saw a similar story in the U.S. Earlier this year when we presented. So owned music includes CDs and digital files. One thought is that respondents of the survey may have considered their curated playlists on Spotify as their own music. We'll see.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think Spotify's comparative strength even stronger in Canada than the United States, and of course the ability to cache music locally in Spotify functionally makes it seem like your owned music, even though it will be ripped from your sad fingers if you ever unsubscribe. Something else that we've been tracking consistently in the Infinite Dial is the percentage of drivers/riders who have some kind of integrated in-dash information or entertainment system in their vehicle. This is a number that Canada has actually led the United States in the last couple of years. In fact, it's considerably higher in Canada. 23% of Canadian drivers/passengers say they have one of these integrated systems in their car, compared to 18% in the US. So as we noted earlier in the percentage who listen to online audio in their car, the technology is there. The bandwidth and unlimited data behavior, I think, just really has to catch up here. But that's starting to be a pretty serious number, right, Stephanie?
Yeah, at 0.25% of Canadian motorists owning a vehicle with in-dash entertainment systems, we see whether it's CarPlay or Google Android or use of a proprietary system from a different car manufacturer, it's a growing number. I think what else is not surprising when you take a look at the long replacement cycle of cars is how slow this growth is. So if you look at the trajectory or the trend lines for the US, we'll see that gradually swell. So in future responses, we may not see that 0.25% grow as dynamically as some of the other numbers that you've quoted.
So we had a question in the Q&A box from Natalie Riel. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Natalie asks, how many Francophones took the survey? And that figure was 36%, which is fairly in line with that figure for the Canadian population. So here's your answer, Natalie. So now we come to podcasting, and certainly this is an area that many people pay very close attention to in the Infinite Dial. And this year we are reporting some significant growth. We start always with the percentage of the population who are familiar with the term. And in Canada, that's essentially identical to the United States. About 3/4 of the population, 12 plus, tell us that they are familiar with the term podcasting. And as I always like to remind people, that doesn't mean they necessarily know the right answer to what it exactly is, but it's at least part of everyday common parlance enough that they are familiar with the term. Now, in terms of monthly podcast listening, the US and Canada are now really identical, 18 plus. 37% of Canadians 18 plus, 37% of Americans 18 plus say they've listened to at least one podcast in the last month. So apples to apples, the two countries are really identical in terms of monthly podcast consumption. And if we go back and look at some of the other countries that we have done the Infinite Dial research in, really the US and Canada lead all of the countries that we have researched significantly in terms of monthly podcast listening, considerably higher than it is in Germany and certainly higher than it is in our recent Australian Infinite Dial study. The demographics of podcast listeners, they're a little more skewed male in Canada than they are in the United States. In the United States, it's starting to get closer to 50-50. When podcasting first began, both in the United States and Canada, it was overwhelmingly a male-dominated medium in terms of consumption. Today, 60% of Canadian monthly podcast consumers are men compared to 40% women. In the United States, again, that's a little bit closer to 50-50. But that is continuing to normalize as it approaches the mainstream populace. And another difference we see between Canada and the United States is in the age composition of podcast listeners. On the left, you'll see the Canadian population 18 plus, that's overall, which is 29% 18 to 34, 34% 35 to 54, and 37% 55 plus. The podcast listener obviously is quite a bit younger there, with 35% 18 to 34 and 41% 35 to 54. But where this differs from the United States is actually much stronger 18 to 34. So sort of the bulge in demographics for the Canadian podcast listener, very much in the middle at 35 to 54, whereas in the United States, that bulge has really grown on the young end. And some of that is certainly due to the increased adoption by the various streaming platforms such as Pandora and Spotify in the United States to not just adopt, but promote podcasting. Now, weekly podcast consumption, again, essentially tied with the US, maybe a skosh higher. 24% of Canadians 18 plus tell us that they have listened to a podcast in the last week. And again, just as we saw with our monthly data, the US and Canada really lead the world here, higher than Australia and considerably higher than Germany and South Africa. And again, these are the last 5 infinite dial surveys that we've conducted. Now, as podcast consumption has gone up, you might imagine, the number of podcasts that we listen to have gone up. This year, we're reporting that if you are a Canadian who listens to podcasts at least weekly, that you listen to 6 podcasts in the last week. And of course, that's an average. You can see here considerable numbers listening to more than that. 22% say 6 to 10, and 11% listen to 11 or more. How does that 6% shape up this year compared to where it's been in Canada, Stephanie?
Well, I think it's indicative that there's more choices on the market with more than 1 million podcasts available now, according to Apple. I mean, there's a lot more content choices out there. Now, interestingly, though, I would say this is much more, had it not been verified that this is pre-quarantine or pre-COVID, I would have said this is more people getting out, trying to find content outside of Netflix when they're on their walks or just somehow getting out of their confines of their houses. But because this happened before, I think this is a trend that we're going to continue to see in terms of people exploring more content genres and making podcasts more of an entertainment source than it has been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to catch a couple of questions here in the Q&A box. Kirk Nesbitt asked, did you gather any data on awareness and actual listening to HD radio? No, we did not. And we're also asked by Kareem Kanji, is podcast listening growing in Canada over the past 3 years? How much? And the answer, of course, is yes, it is. I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but they're similar to the growth that we've observed in the United States. So significant growth really over the past 3 to 4 years in both countries. So hopefully that answers both of those questions. We asked people, what do you most often listen to podcasts with? What is the dominant modality for listening? And again, this is pre-quarantine data. 26% say a computer or desktop or laptop. 74% some kind of mobile device. And one thing that we have seen in our podcast consumer tracker, which is our syndicated study in the United States of podcast consumption amongst weekly podcast consumers, during the quarantine, there's been a little bit more of a shift back towards desktop, laptop listening as we are more homebound and less sort of out and about. And, you know, some of those behaviors will stick, some of those behaviors will not stick, but we have actually seen that go back a little bit towards desktop and laptop consumption. So again, pre-quarantine, where do people listen to podcasts? And you'll note that this adds up to well over 100 because we listen to podcasts in all kinds of places. But at home, certainly the dominant location for listening. In-car is growing. And again, if you recall the percentage of Canadians who have an integrated system with which they could listen to a podcast in the car, that number is 24%. But the percentage of Canadians who listen to podcasts in the car is 40%. So people are using all kinds of ways, both integrated dashboards and Bluetooth connections. And sometimes, sadly, we have researched this by putting headphones on, which I don't encourage. And we also see walking around on foot at a gym while working out, public transportation, and at work. We've asked people yearly if you ever listen to podcasts from public radio producers, which predominantly here is CBC, Radio Canada, and there's some NPR thrown in there as well. And half of all Canadian podcast listeners say that they do ever listen to public radio podcasts or podcasts from public radio producers. So that continues to be fairly strong in terms of consumption in Canada. In the last couple of questions here, we asked people to think about the audio podcast episodes they typically listen to. How much of it do they typically listen to? And I think sort of in earlier days of advertising interest in podcasts, people who are skeptical of the medium would surmise the kind of worst case scenario here, that people would download all of these episodes and not listen to all of them or not listen to any of them, frankly. But when we ask people to listen, to think about the audio podcast episodes that they listen to, how much do they typically listen to? If you add together the entire podcast at 40% and most of the podcast at 35%, that's 80% who say they listen to at least most of the podcast's episodes that they download. And I think, Stephanie, you've got some data here from your sister company, Omni.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those, we've had a long-standing partnership with Omni Studio and a recent acquisition last year of Omni, that we consistently look at the consumption analytics by show, by platform. And so broadly speaking, our metrics on a specific basis, not on survey, but census-based data, is exactly what we're seeing here. The majority of listenership, at least for a less than hour-long show, comes in at just over half of the show being listened to. Of course, that's going to vary by genre. It's going to vary by length. But on average, we mirror what the survey shows here, which is great. And again, we can take a look at it on a platform basis or show basis to get specifics. But I think it's trending that over half are listening to shows.
Super. A few more questions and answers from the Q&A box. Brad Hill, hi Brad, asks, is there any knowledge of whether respondents recognize flash briefing news shows on smart speakers as podcasts? Would the average number of weekly podcasts be higher if so? That's potentially true, and I think as we've seen that number tick up in the U.S. in terms of weekly podcasts consumed, some of that I think may be down to that, and we track that I think a lot more specifically in the Smart Audio Report series that we produce with NPR. Shakar asks, will there be a possibility that these metrics would have increased since the pandemic situation started? We actually did a webinar on that just a couple of weeks ago, Shakar, and it was for the U.S. weekly podcast consumer and not the Canadian, but I suspect it's very similar. And what we saw there really was that the initial days of the pandemic, the initial weeks kind of shook up the snow globe a little bit, and a lot of things got impacted. I think at the start, we listened to a lot less radio. We listened to less in terms of podcasts. And then as things kind of settled down, behaviors have normalized to kind of get back to where they were. And there are some content differences, but I would encourage you to look at that research that we did just a couple of weeks ago on podcasting during the quarantine. All right. We also asked people what percent of all the podcasts that they download would you say you typically listen to? And half say 75 to 100%, and 24% say 51 to 75%. So again, about 3/4 say at least half of the podcasts that they download, they will typically listen to. And again, this is a number that we have actually seen increase a little bit. And certainly some of that's down to modern podcast clients, which will often unsubscribe you to shows if you haven't listened to them in a few weeks. There's also a lot more true kind of on-demand listening to podcasts, especially with platforms like Spotify. And so the number of shows that you actually try to access, whether that's an automatic download or some kind of on-demand listening through a streaming service, the percentage that you're listening to are actually going up a bit as the previous dominant modality for podcasts, which was to download them all automatically and then listen to them later, has really kind of changed a little bit. So I'm going to give you some final observations here, and then Stephanie and I will turn on the cameras and answer any last questions. As Stephanie mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Canadian top 3 mobile carriers' introduction of unlimited data plans last year has had a significant impact on the growth of online data consumption. I think The desire was always there. There was pent-up demand, but now we have seen that pent-up demand realized as people are a bit less anxious about using up their data plans. Monthly and weekly penetration of online audio in Canada is now greater than the U.S. population, at least in terms of persons 18 plus. Again, that pent-up demand has really been released. Smart speaker ownership now exceeds 1 in 4 Canadians 18 plus. That's 26%, with Google products leading the market, which again is different to the United States, where the Amazon Alexa suite of products really has the lead. Spotify, as we've seen, is particularly strong in Canada compared to the United States, although again, Spotify has a sort of an equal competitor in the US right now, Pandora, in terms of reach and usage, or nearly equal. Google performs very well, while Amazon Music lags a bit behind its usage in the US. And again, a lot of that is probably due to smart speaker consumption and defaults. The percentage of Canadian drivers / passengers with an in-dash internet-enabled information and entertainment system is getting pretty close to 1 in 4. And as that unlimited data plan and that behavior catches up in car, when we get back to using cars again, I think we're going to see online audio in the car really surge in Canada. And podcast consumption in Canada as a percentage of the population 18 plus now equals that of the United States. So those two markets really, really similar. So I'm going to stop here, put the camera back on, and see if there are any last questions or chats. All of this will be available very soon. The slides will be up at both edisonresearch.com and tritondigital.com. A replay of this webinar will come up probably tomorrow when it's all put together. And I don't see any other questions or chats that have not been answered.
You mean we didn't get a chat about us coordinating outfits today? I'm stunned.
We did not, no. And that's sort of, that's Edison Triton law for us to coordinate outfits. And we have both gone for the pink shirt look today.
Well, I couldn't pull off a tuxedo of years past with you and John Rosso. So I'm glad you dumbed it down or skinnied it down for me.
Yeah, I mean, about the only variety we get in our lives these days is to choose the virtual background that we use, which this is my actual apartment. And at times I've gone with sort of the view out of our apartment window. We live in downtown Boston. But in the early days of the pandemic, I just went sort of with Laser Bear because Laser Bear seemed appropriate, I think, or all of the books I read and how smart I am. But none of that really worked. So I'm just going back to our apartment here. A couple of quick questions. Do you think people confuse in-dash with Android Auto or Apple CarPlay? Well, I hope so, because that's certainly what that incorporates Android Audio, Apple CarPlay, Toyota's system, Ford's system, all of that is, and in fact, the question itself is much more detailed so that those things are in fact included. Kareem asks, will there be more regular updates for the Canadian market? Well, this is our 3rd annual Infinite Dial that we have done with Triton Digital. I hope it lives forever in perpetuity. And I think as the market continues to evolve, we'll continue to think about ways that we can contribute there, Stephanie.
Absolutely. And we are so thrilled to be a part of this. And thank everyone for taking the time to listen.
Jesse says, unpopular Canadian opinion, but go Bruins and go Tom. I hope the go Tom part is not an unpopular Canadian opinion, but I and the Bruins, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of my colleagues at Edison Research who have done so much work on this, and our friends and partners at Triton Digital who have also done significant work on this and have supported these efforts for these many years. And most of all, to thank you for the gift of your time and attention. And I hope you have a great day. Stay safe.
Bye.